Snow has a way of rewriting reality. It erases footprints, it softens sound, it turns familiar streets into blank pages where time feels suspended. On the night this story begins, the storm arrived without warning, heavy and relentless, swallowing the town whole just as Christmas lights flickered on in windows across the neighborhood. By dusk, the roads were already disappearing. The town of Ridgewood Hollow sat quietly beneath the falling snow, isolated by geography and now sealed off by weather. A place where people knew each other's routines, where strangers stood out, where nothing truly felt hidden. That illusion of visibility had always given residents comfort. That night, it gave someone cover. Inside a modest two-story home at the edge of town, Thomas Keene checked the weather for the third time in an hour. 38 years old, careful by nature, Thomas had always paid attention to details others ignored. The forecast had predicted light snowfall. Instead, the wind howled against the windows and thick white sheets blurred the world outside. The storm was getting worse. He turned away from the window and glanced at the clock, 6:42 p.m., Christmas Eve. Most families were already gathered around tables, carving meals, exchanging small talk, leaning into tradition. Thomas, however, was alone, or at least he was supposed to be. His phone buzzed. A single message, no name attached, just a number he knew by memory. It's starting. Thomas stared at the screen longer than necessary before locking the phone and placing it face down on the counter. His jaw tightened. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. This was the moment everything hinged on: timing, weather, silence. The snow, it seemed, had arrived exactly as planned. Across town, Elaine Foster sat in her car outside the Whitaker residence, her windshield wipers struggling against the thick snow piling faster than they could clear. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale, breath shallow. She hadn't expected the snowfall to intensify this quickly. No one had. But turning back now wasn't an option. The Whitakers' house was warmly lit, decorated modestly but lovingly, wreath on the door, candles glowing through lace curtains. From the outside, it looked peaceful, safe, like a place where nothing bad ever happened. Elaine knew better. She cut the engine and sat in silence, listening to the storm swallow the sound. Snow fell heavily onto the hood, muting everything. It was as if the world beyond the car had ceased to exist. She checked her phone. No new messages. Good. Elaine stepped out into the snow, pulling her coat tight as the cold bit into her skin. Her boots sank immediately, erasing the shallow footprints she left behind almost as soon as she made them. By the time she reached the front steps, the path behind her was already disappearing. Snow, she thought, is the perfect witness. Inside the house, Richard Whitaker was finishing his drink by the fireplace. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed problems could always be managed, contained, or silenced. Christmas music played softly in the background. A half-decorated tree stood in the corner, lights glowing unevenly. He hadn't expected company. When the knock came, sharp against the storm, Richard frowned. Visitors on a night like this were unusual. Visitors on Christmas Eve even more so. He hesitated, then stood smoothing his sweater before walking to the door. Elaine's face when he opened it told him everything. Surprise flashed first, then irritation, then something darker, recognition. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, glancing past her into the storm. "I know," Elaine replied. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "We need to talk." Richard stepped aside reluctantly, letting her in. The door closed behind her with a dull, final sound. Outside, the wind roared louder, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Neither of them noticed how completely the storm had isolated the house. Miles away, Thomas Keene poured himself a glass of water and sat at his kitchen table, lights dimmed, phone silent. If anyone had been watching him, they would have seen a man alone on Christmas Eve, exactly where he claimed he would be. The snow intensified. Road closures were announced one by one. Emergency alerts buzzed through phones across Ridgewood Hollow. Police advised residents to stay inside. Travel was becoming dangerous, if not impossible. By 8:15 p.m., the town was effectively cut off. And somewhere between the falling snow and the glowing Christmas lights, a line was crossed. Inside the Whitaker home, voices rose briefly, then fell again, words spoken that could not be taken back. Accusations long buried finally surfaced. Elaine's coat lay discarded by the door, melting snow pooling beneath it. Richard paced near the fireplace, anger sharpening his movements. Elaine stood near the dining table, arms crossed tightly, refusing to back down. This conversation had been delayed too long. Christmas Eve was not supposed to be the night it happened, but storms don't ask permission. At 8:37 p.m., the power flickered once, then held. At 8:41 p.m., the neighbors' lights went out. At 8:44 p.m., a sound cut through the house that no amount of snow could fully silence. By the time anyone noticed something was wrong, the storm had already done its work. The roads were impassable, footprints were gone, time itself felt blurred by wind and white noise. When police would later reconstruct the timeline, they would struggle to separate fact from assumption, truth from weather, because every suspect had an alibi, and every alibi was wrapped in snow. The storm did not ease overnight. If anything, it deepened its grip on Ridgewood Hollow, tightening around the town like a sealed lid. By morning, snowdrifts pressed against doors, cars were half buried, and roads that once connected neighbors now led nowhere. The world beyond the town might as well have ceased to exist. For a while, no one noticed what had happened at the Whitaker house. That, too, was part of the storm's quiet efficiency. Christmas morning arrived late and muted, the sky a dull gray that offered no sense of time. Inside homes across Ridgewood Hollow, families woke to power outages, spotty cell service, and the slow realization that plans were canceled. Church services were postponed, travel was impossible, emergency crews were stretched thin, responding first to stranded motorists and medical emergencies. A wellness check was low on the list. It wasn't until nearly noon that Margaret Whitaker, Richard's older sister, attempted to reach him for the third time. No answer. Not unusual on a holiday, she told herself at first. Richard valued privacy, but something about the silence bothered her. He always returned calls. Always. By the fourth attempt, concern edged out patience. Margaret lived only 2 streets away, but even that short distance felt daunting. Snow had swallowed sidewalks entirely, forcing her to wade carefully, each step a gamble. When she reached Richard's driveway, she stopped. His car was there, buried but unmistakable. No tracks, no signs of movement. The house stood dark and still, Christmas wreath hanging crookedly on the door as if disturbed and never fixed. Margaret knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, the sound dull against the thick wood. The storm swallowed the echo almost immediately. Her unease grew. Richard should have been inside. He had no reason to leave during a storm like this. Using her spare key, she let herself in. The cold hit her first. The house was unheated, the power out entirely. The air smelled faintly of extinguished candles and something else she couldn't immediately place. The living room was in disarray, not chaotic, but disrupted. A chair out of place, a glass tipped over near the fireplace, its contents long since soaked into the rug. She called his name. No answer. Margaret moved slowly through the house, each step amplifying her dread. When she reached the dining room, she saw the table half set, plates unused, candles melted unevenly as if burned hastily and forgotten. Christmas music sat paused on the stereo, frozen mid-song. And then she saw him. Richard lay on the floor near the fireplace, one arm bent unnaturally beneath him, his body still and pale against the dark wood. There was no blood, no obvious sign of violence, just stillness, final and unmistakable. Margaret screamed. The sound cut through the quiet house, raw and sharp, before being swallowed by the storm outside. Emergency services were called immediately, but help did not come quickly. Roads were blocked. Plowshares were still hours away from reaching the neighborhood. When first responders finally arrived, they moved cautiously, aware that every minute delayed blurred the truth further. Richard Whittaker was pronounced dead at the scene. Cause unknown. Christmas morning became something else entirely. Police secured the house as best they could, though secured was a relative term. Snow tracked in despite precautions. Evidence risked contamination. The storm was not just an obstacle, it was actively rewriting the crime scene. Detective Alan Reeves arrived late in the afternoon, exhausted before he even began. He had already responded to 3 weather-related incidents that day. This one felt different immediately. No forced entry, no obvious weapon, no signs of robbery. And yet, something about the scene refused to settle neatly into natural causes. Reeves walked the house slowly, methodically, letting the space speak. The disturbed furniture, the single glass by the fireplace, the abandoned coat near the front door, a woman's coat, damp at the edges, snow melted into the fabric. That caught his attention. Margaret insisted Richard had not been expecting company. She knew his routines, knew his habits. He rarely entertained unexpectedly, especially during severe weather. So who had been there? The storm complicated everything. Footprints outside were useless, erased completely. Tire tracks were indistinguishable beneath fresh layers of snow. Any timeline reconstructed would rely heavily on testimony rather than physical evidence. And testimony, Reeves knew, was shaped by stress, and stress amplified by weather and fear. Neighbors were questioned next. Most reported seeing nothing unusual, no cars arriving, no lights flickering oddly, no raised voices. The storm had kept everyone inside, windows fogged, curtains drawn. Visibility was near zero by evening. One neighbor mentioned hearing a loud noise sometime after 8:30 p.m., possibly a door slamming, possibly thunder, possibly nothing at all. In a storm like that, sound traveled strangely. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment offered little clarity. No immediate signs of trauma, no clear indicators of a heart attack either. Toxicology would take time, and the weather delayed transport of samples. Everything was delayed, which meant everyone waited, and waiting gave people time to prepare their stories. Thomas Keene was interviewed remotely that evening, his alibi seeming airtight. He had been home alone all night, unable to travel due to the storm. Cell tower data placed his phone at his residence. Utility records confirmed power usage consistent with occupancy. He sounded calm, cooperative, concerned. Too concerned, perhaps. Elaine Foster was harder to reach. Her phone went unanswered until late that night when she finally returned the call, apologizing profusely. She claimed she had lost service during the storm and stayed home the entire evening. Alone, watching the weather worsen. No one could contradict her. The storm ensured that. As night fell again, Ridgewood Hollow felt heavier. The town, already isolated, now carried the weight of unanswered questions. Christmas decorations remained lit in windows, but the cheer felt hollow, almost inappropriate. Detective Reeves reviewed his notes by flashlight, power still unreliable. 2 names circled repeatedly on the page, 2 alibis shaped by weather rather than witnesses. 2 people who had reason to lie, though for very different reasons. The snowstorm had done more than delay help. It had created the perfect alibi.
No cameras captured movement, no witnesses confirmed presence or absence, no footprints remained. The storm erased paths and softened timelines, leaving behind only stories. And stories, Reeves knew, were easy to shape. As plows finally began to clear roads late that night, Ridgewood Hollow slowly reconnected to the world beyond it. But whatever truth had been buried beneath the snow was not going to surface easily. Because by the time the storm passed, the crime had already been rewritten, and someone intended to keep it that way.
Snow protects lies only for so long. As the third day after Richard Whittaker's death arrived, Ridgewood Hollow began to reappear from beneath the white blanket that had hidden it. Snow plows cleared main roads first, carving narrow paths through what had once felt impassable. Cars emerged slowly from driveways, foot traffic returned, and with movement came memory, imperfect, unreliable, but persistent. Detective Alan Reeves understood that timing mattered now. The storm had given everyone distance from the truth, but distance fades, and when it does, stories either hold together or collapse under their own weight. Reeves returned to the Whittaker house early that morning. With the snow partially cleared, the exterior told a clearer story than it had before. While most footprints were gone, subtle impressions remained near the side of the house, shallow depressions partially protected by the overhang of the roof. Not enough to identify footwear, not enough to prove direction, but enough to suggest movement where none had been expected. Someone had been careful. Inside, the house felt less frozen in time now and more like a place interrupted. Evidence technicians moved deliberately, photographing again, noting details overlooked in the urgency of the storm. The woman's coat near the door was bagged properly this time. Elaine Foster's coat. She admitted it when asked. She had stopped by briefly, she said, just to talk, just to clear the air. She claimed she left before things escalated, before anything happened. But escalation, Reeves knew, was rarely acknowledged by the person who caused it. Elaine was brought in later that day for a formal interview. She arrived composed, bundled against the cold, her expression tired but controlled. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing words that could not be misinterpreted. According to her, she had arrived at Richard's house around 7:30 p.m. Christmas Eve. They had talked briefly, an argument, yes, but nothing violent. She said she left before 8 p.m., uncomfortable with the storm worsening and unwilling to stay longer. When asked why she hadn't mentioned this earlier, Elaine blamed panic, fear, the shock of hearing Richard was dead. She insisted she had nothing to hide. Reeves listened without interrupting. Then he asked about her phone. Elaine hesitated. Cell tower data placed her phone near the Whittaker residence until at least 8:50 p.m., nearly an hour longer than she claimed. When confronted with this, she adjusted her story subtly, not dramatically, just enough. She said she must have stayed longer than she remembered. Time had felt strange during the storm. Everything blurred together. Reeves made a note. Blurred timelines benefit liars. Thomas Keene was next. Unlike Elaine, Thomas appeared uneasy from the start. His hands fidgeted, his voice tightened when asked to repeat details he had already provided. He maintained that he had been home all night, snowed in, alone. He mentioned checking weather updates, watching television, texting occasionally. His phone data supported his location, but something else didn't. A text message sent from his phone at 6:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve was missing, not deleted, absent entirely, as if never sent, except the recipient's phone showed it clearly. It's starting. When Reeves placed the printout on the table, Thomas stared at it too long. He explained it away quickly, said it was about the storm, said he had been texting multiple people about weather conditions, but Reeves had already reviewed his phone records. That message had been sent to Elaine Foster, not about the storm.
Thomas and Elaine had a shared history, one they both downplayed, one that explained motive far better than coincidence ever could. Richard Whittaker had been in the way, financially, professionally, and personally. Still, Reeves needed more than implication. The medical examiner's full report arrived that afternoon. Richard Whittaker had not died of natural causes. He had been suffocated. Not violently, not obviously, no bruising consistent with the struggle. Instead, pressure applied steadily, carefully, using an object soft enough to leave minimal marks. A pillow, a folded blanket, something readily available in the house, something easily overlooked during a storm. Elaine was brought back in. This time, the tone shifted. She denied everything again, more firmly now. She insisted she would never hurt Richard. She claimed the coat had been forgotten in haste, that the phone data was misleading, that Thomas's message meant nothing. Reeves let her speak. Then he showed her the medical findings. Elaine's composure cracked for the first time, not in tears, in anger. She accused Richard of manipulation, of threats, of ruining her life quietly, methodically. She spoke of pressure, of fear, of being trapped by what he knew and what he controlled. She did not admit to killing him, but she admitted to staying longer than she claimed, and she admitted Thomas had known she was there. That changed everything. Reeves revisited the timeline again, reconstructing the night minute by minute. The storm had masked movement, but not communication. Messages passed quietly, decisions made remotely, one person present, another ensuring distance, an alibi built from weather and technology. Thomas was confronted next. He broke faster, not fully, but enough. He admitted to coordinating with Elaine, admitted to knowing she was confronting Richard, admitted to hoping the storm would keep things contained. He insisted he never intended for anyone to die. Intent, Reeves reminded him, is not always loud. Sometimes it's silent agreement. As evening fell, Ridgewood Hollow felt smaller again. The storm's power was fading, replaced by clarity and consequence. Roads reopened, power stabilized, normal life crept back in. But for Thomas and Elaine, normal was gone. The snow had hidden the crime, but it could not protect the truth forever, because storms end, and when they do, what remains is everything buried beneath them, waiting to be uncovered. By the time the arrest warrants were drafted, the snowstorm that once paralyzed Ridgewood Hollow had reduced itself to memory. The town looked almost ordinary again. That normalcy unsettled Detective Alan Reeves more than the chaos ever had. Ordinary streets, ordinary houses, ordinary people stepping back into routines as if nothing irreversible had happened. As if a man had not died quietly on Christmas Eve while the town slept behind sealed doors and drifting snow. Reeves understood this phase well. It was when suspects began to believe the danger had passed. Thomas Keene believed it most of all. He was taken into custody first, just after sunrise. Officers found him at home, dressed for work, coat on, keys in hand. He did not resist. He did not ask why. He simply closed his eyes when the cuffs were placed around his wrists, as though the weight of the moment confirmed something he had been carrying alone for days. At the station, Thomas asked for water, then silence. Reeves did not rush him. Silence was often louder than denial. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was hollow. He admitted to knowing Elaine planned to confront Richard. He admitted to encouraging her, not directly, he claimed, but by validating her fear, her anger, her desperation. He spoke about pressure, about consequences, about how Richard's influence felt suffocating even from a distance. He insisted he never told her to hurt him. Reeves asked whether he told her to stop. Thomas had no answer. Elaine Foster was arrested that afternoon. Unlike Thomas, she reacted emotionally. Tears came fast, uncontrolled, followed by long stretches of numb quiet. She repeated the same phrase during transport over and over, as if saying it enough times might make it true. I didn't mean for it to happen. Intent again, always the refuge. During her interrogation, Elaine admitted to staying at Richard's house well past what she initially claimed. She admitted the argument escalated. She admitted fear overtook reason. She admitted placing the pillow over his face, not to kill him, she said, but to make him stop talking, to stop threatening, to stop controlling. She said she didn't realize how still he'd become until it was too late. Reeves had heard this version many times before. The line between silencing someone and ending them is thinner than most people are willing to admit. Elaine described the moment after: the storm roaring outside, the power flickering, the house impossibly quiet. She said she sat there for nearly 10 minutes, unable to move, staring at the snow-covered window as if waiting for something, anything to undo what had already happened. She claimed she called Thomas then, not to confess, to ask what to do. That call lasted 2 minutes and 43 seconds. No words were recorded, but the timing said enough. The prosecution would later argue that the crime was not a spontaneous act born of fear, but the final outcome of planning shaped by opportunity. The storm had been discussed, the isolation anticipated, the alibi rehearsed without ever being spoken aloud. Weather as accomplice. By the end of the day, charges were filed. Second-degree murder for Elaine, conspiracy and obstruction for Thomas, with the possibility of escalation depending on evidence. The town reacted slowly. At first, disbelief, then quiet judgment. Elaine had been familiar, trusted. Thomas had been respected. Their names were woven into Ridgewood Hollow's routines, grocery lines, school events, holiday traditions. People asked the same question in different forms. How could this happen here? Reeves never answered it, because it always did. As the case moved forward, investigators reconstructed the night in painful detail. Surveillance footage from distant traffic cameras showed a vehicle matching Elaine's leaving the neighborhood far later than she claimed. Snowplow GPS logs confirmed roads remained passable longer than expected. Phone metadata showed pattern coordination, gaps where communication ceased simultaneously. The snowstorm alibi began to collapse piece by piece. In court filings, the storm was no longer described as uncontrollable. It was predictable, forecasted, discussed days in advance. The defense attempted to argue panic, emotional instability, lack of premeditation. The prosecution focused on choice. Elaine chose to stay, chose not to leave, chose not to call for help afterward. Thomas chose silence, chose distance, chose weather to replace responsibility. As Christmas passed and the new year began, Ridgewood Hollow tried to move on. Decorations came down, snow melted into slush, streets were salted, life resumed with forced determination. But something permanent had shifted. Neighbors no longer trusted closed doors the same way. Storm warnings carried a different weight. Isolation no longer felt neutral, it felt dangerous. Reeves stood outside the Whitaker house one final time before it was released back to the family. The windows were dark, the driveway clear, the house looked like any other. That was always the most unsettling part. Crimes like this never announce themselves. They hide in familiar rooms between people who know each other too well, waiting for the right conditions. On Christmas Eve, the storm provided those conditions, and when it passed, it left behind a truth no amount of snowfall could bury again. By the time the trial began, winter had loosened its grip on Ridgewood Hollow. The snowbanks that once towered along the streets had shrunk into gray, uneven piles. Roofs dripped steadily in the afternoons.
The storm that had hidden a crime now felt distant, almost fictional, like something exaggerated by memory. Yet inside the courthouse, every detail of that Christmas Eve was being replayed with surgical precision. Elaine Foster sat at the defense table, smaller somehow than she had appeared in photographs. Her shoulders were often hunched, her hands folded tightly together as if holding on to something invisible. Thomas Keene sat several rows back, separated now not only by benches and guards, but by consequences neither had fully understood when they relied on weather to protect them. The prosecution opened with a simple statement. "This case is not about a snowstorm," the attorney said. "It is about choice." They laid out the story slowly, methodically. Forecasts discussed days in advance, messages exchanged quietly, a confrontation planned to occur when no one could interrupt. They described how the storm did not create chaos, it created opportunity. Roads closed, phones died, neighbors stayed inside, and in that isolation, a man was silenced forever. The defense countered with emotion. Elaine's attorneys painted her as overwhelmed, manipulated, pushed into a moment she could not escape. They emphasized fear, panic, confusion. They reminded the jury that there were no weapons, no bruises, no obvious signs of violence. They argued the storm distorted time and judgment, turning an argument into tragedy. Thomas's defense was quieter. They argued distance, they argued ignorance, they argued that silence was not intent, that failing to act was not the same as planning harm. Detective Alan Reeves testified on the fourth day. He spoke without drama, without anger. He described the house as he found it, still, untouched, almost peaceful. He described how stories changed, not drastically but subtly, how alibis formed around assumptions instead of facts, how the storm initially complicated everything, then slowly revealed what it had concealed. When asked what stood out most about the case, Reeves paused. "Everyone thought the snow erased responsibility," he said. "It didn't. It just delayed it." The jury deliberated for 2 days. Outside, spring rain replaced snow, washing away what winter had left behind. The town waited quietly. No crowds gathered, no cameras camped overnight. Ridgewood Hollow did not want spectacle. It wanted closure. The verdicts came on a Thursday afternoon. Elaine Foster was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom did not erupt. Elaine did not scream. She simply closed her eyes, her face collapsing inward as if the weight she had been carrying finally pressed down all at once. When asked if she wished to speak before sentencing, she stood slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "I thought silence would protect us. I was wrong." Thomas Keene was found guilty of conspiracy and obstruction. He stared straight ahead as the verdict was read, jaw clenched, expression frozen. Later, during his statement, he admitted something he never had before. "I believed doing nothing was safer than doing the right thing," he said. "I see now that it was the most dangerous choice I could have made." Sentencing came weeks later. Elaine received a lengthy prison term, one that would carry her far beyond the memory of snowstorms and holiday lights. Thomas received fewer years, but the stain of his role would follow him just as relentlessly. Richard Whitaker's family spoke last. They did not seek revenge, they did not shout. They spoke about absence, about an empty chair at Christmas dinner, about how silence, once comforting during snowfall, now felt unbearable. When the proceedings ended, Ridgewood Hollow exhaled. Life resumed in fragments. New routines formed. The Whitaker house was sold. Another family moved in, unaware at first of the history behind the walls. Over time, the story faded into quiet recollection, something mentioned carefully, usually when winter storms rolled in again.
but the lesson lingered. People paid closer attention to forecasts, to messages left unanswered, to arguments postponed instead of resolved. The storm had taught the town something it could not unlearn: that isolation does not create monsters, it reveals them. Detective Reeves retired the following year. On his last day, he drove past the Whitaker house one final time. Children were playing in the yard now. The windows were open. Music drifted softly into the street. The house looked harmless again. Reeves knew better. He had learned long ago that crimes like this don't rely on darkness alone. They rely on trust, on assumption, on the belief that circumstances will excuse decisions. The snowstorm was the perfect alibi. Until it wasn't. Because weather passes, seasons change, snow melts. And when it does, what remains is the truth, cold, clear, and impossible to bury forever.